Have you ever wanted to make a hexagon-shaped quilt or any other shaped quilt besides the typical square or rectangle, but were you stumped at the thought of how to bind such an odd shape? Well, in this video, I'm going to demystify that binding process for you. Hi there, my name is Janie. If you're new here, welcome to the MakerJayne channel, where I share all things English paper piecing, from tips and tutorials to projects and more. So if you love EPP like I do, please consider subscribing. If you're returning, welcome back. I am so excited you're here. This month, inside of my EPP membership, we worked on a fun hexy potholder project. And in the final phase of the workshop, I taught my members how to go about binding the hexagon shape. It's the same method that I use to bind larger hexagon-shaped quilts. And it's the same method that can be used to bind other unusual shapes as well. My binding process is so simple and easy to do that I didn't want you to miss out. So I clipped out a portion of that workshop and I've put it into this video. The following is an excerpt from this month's workshop from inside of my membership. You're going to see me working on a fairly small EPP project. It is a potholder after all. However, keep in mind that the process I walk you through can be applied to any larger project or quilt that's an unusual shape, like for instance, a hexagon, an octagon, or triangle, etc. At the end of this video, I'm also going to tell you how you can get the pattern for the project that you're going to see me working on in the video. So if you like what you see, make sure to watch until the end. All right, let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, we are on the home stretch. All we have to do is attach our binding and then we'll be done. So we're going to go ahead and start grab your potholder and your binding strip that you just pressed. You want to line up the raw edge, long raw edge, with the outer edge of your potholder. But before we do that, we want to leave a little bit of extra fabric hanging. So you don't want to secure this down to your potholder. You want to have a little bit of a tail where you start. We're going to be attaching it to the front of the potholder first, and then we'll flip it over to the back when we get to that step. Now, because the length of our quilt is so short, you want to remember to not start stitching in the middle or back here. You want to start your stitching in this area. So that's where I'm going to begin my clipping. Okay? I'm going to walk you through how to do your folds for a hexagon shape and how to get all the way around with the binding as we head over to the sewing machine next. For this step, we're going to be using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Remember, because we have an extra 1/8 of an inch on the outside of our block fabric. So if we take that 1/8 of an inch plus 1/4 of an inch, that should bring us to the very edge or end of our EPP stitches that make up that seam allowance for the block. So 3/8 of an inch seam allowance is what we're working with. We're going to lift the presser foot as high as it can go because remember we've got all these layers. Go ahead and slide it underneath your presser foot. I'm going to go ahead and remove my clip. And I think this is a good place to start. I just want to point out, let me turn my work slightly so you can see what I'm talking about. So we want to leave enough room between where we start and where we come all the way back around and end. We want to leave a gap here where we don't actually sew our binding down because we need space so that we can join our binding before we finish it off. So in order to leave enough space on such a short little edge, we're going to need to start our initial stitching as far to the left, in this case, as far in this direction as possible. So I'm aiming for about 1 inch. I'm going to be starting right about here as I start stitching this edge. So I'm going to drop my presser foot, I'm going to drop my needle, And you're going to take a couple of stitches forward, and then take a couple stitches backwards to go ahead and lock that stitching. You want to make sure that you lock your stitching at the beginning and the end, because we're going to be handling the binding after this step. We're going to be handling it a little rough. We're just going to need to be, really manipulating it to finish the binding off. And so you want to make sure that your stitches hold while you're doing that. So a little bit of a back stitch here. And then again, when we get round to the other side, you'll want to back stitch at the end as well. I'll remind you of that when we get there. What we're going to do is we're going to remember we're working with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So as we stitch, we're going to come to the edge of our work, but we're going to stop 3/8 of an inch before we get to the edge of our work. So we're going to work towards that edge, but we're going to stop early. So let's go ahead and begin. And what I like to do is I like to just kind of press the binding over the edge so I can kind of see where the edge of the project will fall. And I'm visualizing where that's going to be. So I'm not looking at the short end of that. Where I'm looking is right where the needle is, because that's where the stitching is actually happening. So I want 3/8 of an inch from my needle to the edge of my project. So I need to go a little bit farther. And you might have noticed on my particular presser foot, I have these little red lines. This is a 1/4 inch presser foot, and that red line on the front of the presser foot tells me where a 1/4 inch is. And so from that line, I can kind of eyeball an 1/8 inch past that line, which is right about where I'm at right now. Okay, so I am about 3/8 of an inch away from this front edge of my project, which is exactly where I want to be. My needle is down, and I'm going to go ahead and lift my presser foot. So with the needle down, lift up your presser foot. You're going to then rotate your work slightly, maybe about 45 degrees, and you're going to put your machine in reverse. Okay, so my machine's in reverse, and I'm going to stitch backwards right off the edge of my project. Just like this. Okay? Once you've done that, you can cut your threads, and then we're going to reposition. So we can lift up our presser foot, pull out the work, and I'm going to set this on the table to kind of show you a little bit better of what we're going to be doing next. So because we sewed backwards, we have a nice little angle stitch there, and it kind of acts as its own little securing stitch. If I move this binding, it's not going anywhere, okay? So that's why we sew backwards, and we sew off the edge so that we don't accidentally sew in the direction we don't want to be sewing. So that's why I like to angle it at a nice 45 degrees and just angle it right off the edge of my work. So now that we have that nice corner, what we can do is use that corner as our reference for our miter fold. So I'm just going to fold my binding up, and I'm going to position my work so that my point is perpendicular to me and how I'm sitting and looking at it. So I've got the points of my hexagon going in a perpendicular direction, and I want the fold of my binding to match that perpendicular action with the points that are through the center of my hexagon. Once you have that in a position that you like, what I like to do is secure it with my fingers so that it doesn't shift. And then I turn my work so that now this edge is parallel with how I'm looking at it. So it's right in line with how I'm looking at it. Continuing to hold the fold with my left hand, I'm going to fold the binding over on itself, and I'm going to line up this raw edge with the raw edge of the project. Now, my middle finger's in the way because it's not letting me fold all the way over. I've got this extra fabric up here. So without moving my index finger, I'm going to move my middle finger. My index finger is still holding that fold. And I'm just moving my middle finger out of the way so that I can flatten this out, because I want this top fold to be right at the point of the hexagon. Okay, so let me come in a little bit closer so you can see what that looks like. So I haven't moved my index finger. It's still holding that fold underneath. And I'm just folding this over so that the fold starts right where the edge of the binding stopped from my previous edge. So right at the point of my project is where this new fold starts, and the rest of the edge of the binding is lining up with the rest of the edge of the fabric, or the project here. So now I'm going to go ahead and press that fold down, and I can either pick this up and take it to my sewing machine, or sometimes I like to go ahead and clip it, because sometimes it's just easier to not shift things out of the way when I clip it. And I'll go ahead and reposition the camera. So now we've got that second edge in position. I obviously can't put this under my machine because the clip's on it, so I now need to remove the clip, but that just held it in place as I was moving things over. So again, make sure your presser foot is as high as it will go, because we've got so many layers. And you're going to slide this underneath your presser foot while you're holding on to these folds, because you don't want them to shift. As you bring it underneath your presser foot, you want to come forward a little bit with your needle. So slide your work past your needle slightly so that you've got about 1/4 of an inch behind your needle, because we're going to backstitch first. So we want to have a little bit of room back there to stitch onto. Line up the edge of your project with that 3/8 of an inch, and then you can go ahead and drop your presser foot. And I'm going to go ahead and drop my needle as well. I've got my machine in reverse. So put your machine in reverse if it's not there already, and go ahead and stitch backwards. And that's going to secure this new edge. Okay, I took a few stitches. Now I'm going to come forward. And again, just keeping an eye on the edge here with that 3/8 of an inch, making sure that my binding strip is lining up with that edge, and continuing on. Okay, and as we approach this next corner, we're going to do the same thing we did with the previous corner. Kind of find where the edge of the project is, and then you're going to eyeball or measure, if you want, with your needle. So the distance from your needle to the edge of your project, you want it to be about 3/8 of an inch. Whatever your seam allowance is for whatever project you're working on is what you want this distance to be. So in this case, it's 3/8 of an inch. In another project, it might be 1/4 of an inch. It all depends on what seam allowance you're working with. And that'll help you. You can take this and apply this to any other quilt project with any other angles that you might be working with for creating a mitered corner. So I am 3/8 of an inch or so away from that edge. I'm going to leave my needle down. I'm going to raise my presser foot. I'm going to turn my work in a counterclockwise direction, and I'm going to put my machine in reverse, drop my presser foot, and I'm going to stitch in reverse off the edge of my project and cut my threads. Okay, and then I'm going to repeat what I did earlier with the folds and all of that. I'm going to repeat that with this corner. So I'll go ahead and show you that one more time, and then I'll let you do the rest of them on your own. So again, I've got my work sitting perpendicular to me so that the points of my hexagon are in a perpendicular position to myself. And I'm going to fold my binding up. And I might have stitched a little bit too far. If you do stitch too far, what will happen is where that stitching ends and where you turned, it's going to prevent your binding from being able to fold up to the place where it needs to fold. So if you stitch too far, this fold will actually be below the center point of your hexagon. And so you might have to redo that stitching. And actually, I did go way too far past. So I've got about 1/8 of an inch past the edge of my work. And so if I were to continue on, that's going to put my entire binding strip too far past my work. So I need to redo this seam. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my seam ripper and I'm just going to lift my binding and just undo that one stitch, being careful not to cut the fabric. There we go. And then from that one stitch, you can kind of gently pull, and that will release a few of the stitches just behind that. There's no need to go through and redo all the stitches. I just wanted to release those corner stitches. And what I'm going to do is now I'm going to reposition and just redo that little jog. Okay, so here we are. My old stitching came all the way to here, so I was definitely too far. And my new stitching is about 1/8 of an inch behind that, so I think I'm right on now. And so we're going to repeat what we wanted to do earlier, which is we're going to position the hexagon. So I've got my points here, so it's perpendicular to me looking at it. I'm going to fold my binding up so that I make a fold that is also perpendicular to me, and that's in line with those points. And one of the ways that I like to just visually check, not only, this way if it's in line, but I'm also looking at the edge of my binding, because I want the edge of my binding to hit right at the corner of my project. And when I go to fold this back over, the edge of this binding should also line up with the edge of my project down here as well. So that's another visual cue that you can use to make sure that you're in the right place. So that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and secure it with my fingers. I'm going to rotate my work, and I'm going to flip my binding over, moving my middle finger as I need to, and it looks pretty good, and folding that binding over so that it's right in line with the edge of this next side that we're going to stitch. And I'm just going to make that crease and go ahead and clip it so it doesn't move. Okay, so we're going to repeat what we just did on this side. So again, I'm going to lift my presser foot up, remove the clip as I hold the folds in place, position everything under the presser foot, pushing the work back behind the needle about 1/4 of an inch, double checking that I'm at my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance with the edge of my project. I'm going to lower my presser foot, lower my needle, put my machine in reverse, and go ahead and stitch backwards a few stitches, and then come forward. And you'll repeat this exact same thing for the remaining corners. When we get to the final corner, I'll show you how we're going to finish off that corner as we get back to where we started. Okay, I'm coming up on my final corner. I'm going to repeat the same exact process for this final corner. I'm going to fold my binding back to the place that I want it, and then fold it forward again, lining the edges up and that point with the final edge of the work here. I'm going to place it back underneath my sewing machine and line up with my 3/8, reverse stitch, and come forward. Now when I come forward, I'm going to stop about 1 inch from where I started, because I want to remember to leave a gap here so that we can join the binding. So I'm going to stitch a little bit farther. There we go. Okay, that's probably good. And then I'm going to reverse so that I can secure those stitches so they don't come undone on me. and cut the threads. Okay, so now this is where we started and this is where we ended. So we have this extra tail. We're going to go ahead and head over to the work table and we're going to cut off the extra, and I'm going to show you what to do with these two tails. Okay, first things first is we need to cut off all of this extra binding here. But before we do, we want to make sure that we don't cut off too much. So what I like to do is I like to just place the two bindings as if we were going to join them just like this. I like to just place them down on the project, and so that they're nice and flat. There's no kinks or curls or anything. And then I'm going to go ahead and just let the rest of it come up like this between my fingers and kind of see where the shorter piece ends, and take my scissors and cut the longer piece right in that same general area. So now we've got this extra binding free. I'm just going to toss that over because we don't need that anymore. What we want to do for this next step is we want to join these two binding pieces together. And I'm just going to show you the kind of the quick and dirty way to do that. And because we're using such a small project, this is really the easiest way I have found to join these. So you're going to need a pin for this step. And what we want to do is we want to place our fingers right at the point where the binding meets and starts turning upward. And we want to try to place our pin right at that meeting place, right at the bottom of that meeting place. That's going to simulate the seam line that we want to stitch. So once you have your pin there, what you want to do then is you want to actually separate or pull your project away from your binding, and you want to get this underneath your sewing machine, and you want to try to avoid any of your pot holder pieces or layers. So what we want to do is we want to take our binding, and if you need to, you can kind of fold your pot holder like this, or quilt, whatever it is you're working on. If you're going to be using this technique for another project, you can do the same thing with your quilt or whatever other type of project you're working on. So you're going to fold this up like a sandwich, like a taco kind of, right? That way it allows your binding strips to lay nice and flat against each other. We're going to take this over to our sewing machine. So here we are at the sewing machine. We're going to place this underneath our presser foot, and we want the pin to go right in line with where our needle is, because remember, the pin is marking where we want our stitch line. And I just need to kind of straighten that out a little bit. And so what I'm looking at is I'm making sure that the edges of my two binding strips are lining up on this front edge. And then I'm going to position this. What I like to do is I like to put the whole thing underneath the presser foot so that I can visualize or visually see where the needle is in line with the pin. And then I pull it forward, straight forward, without going side to side, because I know that's exactly where I want to stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and drop my presser foot. I'm going to pull my pin out so that it's not in the way of my needle, and I'm going to go ahead and start stitching. Now, you want to do a back stitch here because you want to make sure that this is secure. You don't want it to come apart as you're, trying to maneuver it later on when you're actually finishing up the next steps. So back stitch at the beginning, and then go ahead and continue pulling your pin out. I know I am where I want to be. All I have to do is sew straight. So just sew straight ahead. Once you've got your pin out, don't worry, just don't move anything. And then you want to back stitch at the other end. And you can cut your thread. And so now we have our binding strips attached, like so. So when we open up our work, everything should lay nice and flat against the project. Now what you can do is come back in with some scissors, and I'm just going to do it right here so I don't have to move the camera again. You can lift up the extra tails of your binding strips and cut about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch away from your stitching, making sure that you're only cutting your tails. You don't want to accidentally cut everything that you just, you don't want to cut any of the binding that we're going to be attaching to the project. So that is it. That's how you attach your bindings to each other. The next thing you want to do is just finger press your seam allowances open that you just sewn. And we're going to go ahead and finish stitching this edge of the binding strip down to the project. We're going to start where we've already got some stitching. So we can just start in that same place, just double checking that we're still at that 3/8 of an inch here. And I'm going to go ahead and drop my needle. I'm going to hold my seam allowances open so that they don't curl over as I come up to them. So I'm just going to hold those down with my finger. And because we already have some stitching there, you don't have to backstitch. You can just stitch right over your previous stitching, and that will secure your stitches. Stitch all the way until you get to the other side. And I just fold my binding over because you don't want to accidentally catch your miter corner. You want to fold that out of the way and continue stitching. And then you can secure your stitches with a back stitch if you want, and cut your threads. Okay, so we've got the binding attached to the front of our work. Let me show you how we're going to handle these interesting miters as we fold everything over. So I'll meet you over at the work table. Okay, so the next step is to go ahead and fold your binding over to the wrong side of your project. And because we did the special little technique when we were stitching the binding on with the little jog, the miter automatically forms its own little fold. You don't even have to go in and really touch it up. It just automatically creates that beautiful miter. Okay, so now what we can do is go ahead and secure our binding onto the back of our work. And for the stitching for this part of the project, I highly recommend hand stitching your binding down because that way you're not going to see the stitching on the front of your work. You want to try to keep it nice and clean. And this is what your binding will look like if you do your hand stitching. It's just a nice, clean finish, and you don't have to worry about any of your stitches coming through to the front of your work. If we were to machine stitch this, then your machine needle is going to go through your whole work and you're going to have stitches on the front as well. And that's, in my opinion, a little unsightly. So you're going to fold everything over, and as you get to these corners, you'll fold one side over and then you'll fold the other side over. And you might have to kind of play with it just a little bit to create a nice fold or crease. And then you can clip these in place, and then as you hand stitch, you can remove your clips. But what I actually like to do is I like to fold all of my flat edges first and then come back around and do the corners. But I do want to also show you how to handle this seam allowance of our bindings. What I like to do is I like to take the corners of the seam allowance and kind of fold them over on themselves, make a little paper airplane type of thing here, before folding the binding over. Just like that. And then folding the whole thing over onto the back and securing it. And that usually takes care of those seam allowances. Once you've got all of your edges and corners in place, then you can finish it off with some hand stitching. And that is how to bind a hexagon quilt or any other unusual shape like an octagon or triangle. Now, even though this was demonstrated on a very small project, keep in mind that it's the same process that you can use for any size project. It's going to be the same for larger projects as well. When it comes to those corners, just remember that the place you're going to want to stop at that corner is going to be whatever the seam allowance measurement is that you're using to add the binding to your particular project. So in my case, I was sewing the binding using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Therefore, I stopped at that 3/8 inch mark before I got to that corner. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I'd love to know, do you have a current project you're working on or a future project in mind that's an odd shape like a hexagon or octagon? Tell me about it in the comments. What unusual shaped project are you wanting to bind? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. That's going to tell YouTube that you found the video helpful, and then they're going to show it to more quilters like you. If you want to learn how to get the pattern and the full-length workshop for the project shown in this video, and you like the idea of joining a fun community of fellow piecers, then be sure to visit the link in the description where you can learn more about my membership, what's included each month, and how you can join us. I really hope that this video was helpful for you in showing you how to bind a hexagon quilt. If you have any questions about the process I showed, make sure you leave them in the comments below. I enjoy reading all of your comments, and I try to reply as quickly as possible. Thanks so much for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep on stitching.